Starting right now. Let's do this. The Cult of Hockey podcast by the faithful and for the faithful. Can you see me, Bruce? Oh, there we go. I'm David Staples of the Edmonton Journal, and I'm here today with Bruce McCurdy. Hey, Bruce.
Hey, David. How are you doing tonight?
I am doing well. I'm doing well.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Good.
All right. We've covered the basics. You can see me, and I can hear you.
Excellent.
All right. The monkeys can see and the monkeys can do tonight. We're ready. We're good to go. No, I mixed the metaphor. What's that one where the monkeys? One has his hand
monkey
over
see,
his
monkey can do. Yeah. See no evil, hear no evil.
That's what I was trying to get at. I forgot. I got the wrong.
Speak no evil.
I got the wrong monkey analogy. So
see no evil, hear no evil. Well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad.
That's us. We're here to speak evil about the Edmonton Oilers. No, we never do that. We're big Oiler fans. Bruce, let's talk. We're on our unending investigation into the Oilers' upcoming, the distant future series against the Chicago Blackhawks. And we're finding out a little bit about that. We're digging into the Oilers and we're figuring out what their lineup should be. So this is the longest playoff preview in history. And anyone still with us in this marathon playoff preview, congratulations and thank you very much for hanging in there. I hope that you're finding this interesting. I'm actually kind of finding it interesting. I'm finding lots of interesting tidbits and so are you. So tonight we're going to talk about where James Neal is going to fit into the cornucopia of Edmonton Oilers lines heading into the Chicago Blackhawks series. We're going to talk about the Blackhawks forward lines and who might go where. We're going to talk about varying success of different Oiler lines, and we'll dig into also who should play with Connor McDavid. Let's start with James Neal, Bruce. Sure. What are you thinking about where James Neal is going to fit into this Oilers lineup come early August? Is that when it's going to be?
Something like that.
Frack.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been looking long and hard at James Neal. I'm writing about him tonight, and you know, you look at the Oilers stats from the year, and he's in the top 6 in basically every category: ice time against elites. He's 4th on the team in goals. He's 5th, I think, among forwards in points, or 6th. He's just right on the cusp of the top 6. And then, of course, at the trade deadline, they went out and they traded for 2 sort of skilled wingers that could vie for that ice time spot in the top 6 in Andreas Athanasiou and Tyler Ennis, who could be knocking Neal off of his perch. And my original thought was, you know, if Neal gets knocked out of the top 6, he could get knocked right out of the lineup, because we've been talking in terms of on the 3rd and 4th lines. I know you've been talking about Joachim Nygard moving in alongside of Sheahan and Archibald. And on the 4th line, there's a variety of options, and the Oilers are not hurting for depth. They got a nice group of forwards this year.
They do.
But when I dug into one particular stat category, it hit me over the head that I don't know what line he's going to be on, but I'd be just totally shocked if James Neal is not in the lineup, at least for the beginning of the playoffs, unless there's something wrong, like he's comes back and he's not ready or what have you. And that is playoff experience. And it is just very striking. If you look at the Oilers' entire roster of experience in the playoffs, James Neal has played 104 playoff games in his career. In fact, this will be his 10th year in a row playing in the playoffs for a playoff team. He's been on some pretty good teams over those years, and he's been a good support player in Pittsburgh, Nashville. I won't say much about Calgary, but Las Vegas, he was a useful player there. And he's lost some of his edge over the years, but 104 playoff games played, so he's over 100. Not one other Oiler has even 50. Chris Russell is next with 49, and then you drop all the way down to Alex Chiasson with 30, and Riley Sheahan with 29. I mean, all these guys, got most of their playoff experience on other teams until you get down to, Connor McDavid 13, Leon Draisaitl 13, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins 13, Darnell Nurse 13, Oscar Klefbom 12. They all played in 2017. So it's crucial, essential that they have some playoff experience, but it sure isn't much. And those 104 games, and especially when you're lining up against a team like Chicago Blackhawks, and you look at the guys on their team: Jonathan Toews, 128, Patrick Kane, 127, Duncan Keith, 126. The same guys played all those games over all those years. Brent Seabrook, 123. Now, he's a doubtful starter. We don't know for sure. There's a few guys on Chicago's list that had what they thought were season-ending surgeries, but 3 months later, who the hell knows? They were supposed to be getting better over the summer. And whether Seabrook's on that list, Corey Crawford is Chicago's fifth most experienced playoff guy with 87 games. Edmonton's fifth most is Mike Smith, also their goalie, with 24 games. I mean, it's just a huge disparity in experience from one team to the other. And that is the one thing that James Neal has in spades. And I'm convinced that for that reason alone, uh, Coach Dave Tippett is going to find a way to get him into the lineup for the start of that series. And, play it out, depending on how he plays, of course. We'll see what happens. But I think they're going to really value that. I think all 200 hockey men value playoff experience, and I do as well.
Bruce, I'm going to get into this particular stat. Dave Tippett kind of tipped his hand, I thought, about what he's thinking for the fourth line. If you go back to his interview with Bob Stauffer on, was it Tuesday? No, Wednesday. And I remember that because Dave Tippett bumped me off the show that day. So.
Oh, yeah. Imagine.
So on the next day, it's okay. And congratulations, by the way, to Bob Stauffer and Oilers Now. They absolutely dominated the radio rankings. They
crushed it on the ratings.
Yeah, so Bob's got a great show. He's a very, very hardworking guy, extremely knowledgeable. His show is a must listen, I think, if you're an Oilers fan. So way to go, Bob Stauffer. So Bruce, Tippett said that he liked the line of Chiasson, Kara, and Neal. They played together and played some really heavy hockey. So I checked into this. They are bigger guys, all of them over 200 pounds, well over 200 pounds. I think Chiasson's 210 if he's not the smallest of them. Maybe Neal's not 200 pounds. I'm not sure. He's kind of
he's 212, 6'3", 212. He's a big man.
So that line played 34 minutes, only 34 minutes together. So it's a pretty small sample size. But I can see why Tippett's stuck in his head, because they scored 3 goals for, had 0 goals against. So in a very that's going to stick in your head. And I'll tell you what, it's pretty hard to find line mates who had success with Jujhar Khaira, honestly, this year. I don't want to be too cruel to the player, but maybe there's a line I'm not thinking of, Bruce, but I can't. So I looked at Khaira when he played with Archibald and Sheahan. They had a 25% goals for percentage. Okay, and that was 156 minutes.
Yeah, they started the year together, and they struggled mightily, and 2 of them got hurt, and there was a lot of sort of feeling out going on at the beginning with those guys.
Gets worse. He played 107 minutes, which is, again, that's like, 7 games. Well, if you're on the fourth line, that's like 10 games together with Sheahan and Patrick Russell, Khaira did. Bruce, they had a 14% goals for percentage. Yeah. 1 goal for
6 against.
So you can see Dave Tippett thinking, who am I going to have on my fourth line with Jujhar Khaira? Like we want him because he's big. In the playoffs he can be tough. But most of all, he's a crucial penalty killer. We got to have normally we might go with Haas, but Khaira's the penalty kill guy. I don't think we're going to see Gaetan Haas. So listen, there's no betting line on this, what the Oilers' fourth line is going to be. But if it's
Right.
not Kara, Chason, and Neal in the first game, I like there could be injuries or something like that. But if other than that, that's the fourth line in the first game. So I think your prediction is correct. And the little bit of research I did on this completely backs up your hypothesis that James Neal will be in the lineup. Neal also, Bruce, he didn't have a whole lot of success on other lines. And I'll just quickly run down which lines did have success. The top line was Kara, Chason, Neal with that 100% goals for percentage. You can't beat that. Excuse me. But they played together so little that it's hardly. Then we have the single best line in the NHL, the Dynamite line with Draisaitl, Yamamoto, and Nugent Hopkins. 328 minutes together at even strength. A goals for percentage, Bruce, of 77%. 30 goals for and 9 against.
Yeah, they were red hot for sure.
That's rocking it. The next best line, both these lines had limited time together. Haas, Russell, and Granlund, 50% goals for percentage in 87 minutes. Nygaard, Archibald, and Sheahan, 50% goals for percentage in 68 minutes. Then, and here's kind of a shocking and somewhat disappointing number. McDavid, Draisaitl, and Kassian in 455 minutes, 31 goals for, 32 goals against, 49% goals for percentage.
Yeah, they were a huge plus through the first quarter of the season, and they gave it all back in the second quarter, and then Tippett broke them up for the rest of the season. They didn't play as a line. And it was because of the bleeding of goals against in the second quarter.
If you can think of any other line, if you can think of any other lines that I missed, I'm trying to think of lines that I missed, like players who played together along a lot, and I couldn't really think of so I have the Sheahan line,
right,
and I have Sheahan, Archibald, and Kara, but I couldn't think of any other. Was there like a Nugent Hopkins? When Nugent Hopkins had his own line, who was he usually with? Was it with Neal? And
he played a lot with Neal for sure.
And who else would that be?
A lot of Chason,
All right, I'll search those lines and
I know that so if you put Nygaard though with Sheahan and Archibald, then in your top six you got left wingers Nugent Hopkins. Let's leave him where he's been playing.
Yeah,
really
the Dynamite line together.
Then then who do you put with McDavid? Then do you put Ennis or do you put Athanasiou? And which one do you put in the press box?
Okay, here's an interesting thing for you, Bruce. I'm going to name two groups of 4 wingers, and I want you to guess which wingers had the better goals for percentage when they were teamed with Connor McDavid. So here's the first 4 wingers: Joakim Nygaard, Andreas Athanasiou, Josh Archibald, and Zach Kassian. That's Group A. Okay.
Yeah.
Group B is Ryan Nugent Hopkins, Leon Draisaitl, Sam Gagner, and James Neal. Which group?
I go with group number 1.
It's not close.
Yeah.
It's not close. Nygaard in 54 minutes had a 75% goals for percentage. Athanasiou in 44 minutes, 66%. Archibald in 150 minutes, 66%. And Kassian, 56 minutes, it was just 52%. But the other guys, Nugent Hopkins, 47%. Draisaitl, 45% goals for percentage. Gagner, 45%. And James Neal, 41%. 11 goals for, 16 against when McDavid and Neal were on the ice at even strength. Now, I should say this. These are small sample sizes, and it's also goals are a small sample size, right? So this could be misleading. There could be a certain level of misdirection in these numbers, and they shouldn't necessarily direct your course of action. Nonetheless, it should direct your course of action to some extent, probably a great extent. When you look at the Dynamite line's success, if you don't have that line together in the first game, I think it's coaching malpractice at the NHL level. And you can't, and if you have Patrick Russell, Jujhar Khaira, and Riley Sheahan with their 14% goals for percentage, again, that would be coaching malpractice. But Bruce, what I found interesting is
Mm-hmm.
McDavid doesn't seem to need to play with skilled players to have success. He can play with Nygaard, Athanasiou, Archibald, and Cassian, who are all similar kind of fast, straight up and down players, up and down the wing, agitate, go to the net, fast back and forth players. Each one of those guys. And there was more success with those guys,
Mm-hmm.
those up and down straight line guys, than there were with the more creative guys like Nugent Hopkins, Draisaitl, Gagne, and James Neal, who's I guess he's more of a shooter at this point than anything. He's not really a fast. He's not really a
He's not a
creative.
fast train, that's
Not a,
for sure.
and he's not a great passer of the puck. But
Right.
what do you make of that, if anything?
Well, yeah. The goals for is a very volatile statistic, and that some of the underlying statistics that should produce good goals for, the correlation wasn't great this year. And goals for, I mean, I'm a goals guy myself. I value goals way over shots, of course. I mean, that's how you win games. But they do have the biggest error bar because you have the smallest sample, right? You have one
Yeah,
goal for every 10 shots for every 20 Corsi events. So you just don't compile your data set at anywhere near the speed that you do the shot metrics. Uh, but I mean, shots are shots. I mean, we talked about this before. You know, I'd rather have Leon Draisaitl shooting from a one-timer from the right face-off circle than Andrei Sekera trying to shoot one through a bunch of shin pads from outside, right?
yeah.
And it's a uh, it's volatile, but I value it, and so I would definitely would keep the dynamite line together. And, you know, Stauffer, he put out his own lines the other day, and basically they were the same 12 forwards as the Oilers used in Game 71. And all he did was switch Nugent Hopkins back to playing with Leon and Yamamoto, and he switched Tyler Ennis back from that line to with Connor and Cassian. And then he had Athanasiou with Sheahan and Archibald that did play in Game 71, and as did the Neal Kara Chiasson line that we've been talking about, played in Game 71. So where does Joakim Nygaard go, whether he's ready or not? Like, who does he take out? My original thought was maybe he takes James Neal's place. And then I looked at, you know, playoff experience, 104 games to 0. I have a feeling the coach is going to go with the 104, you know, just a gut feeling.
Yeah, Nygaard may be on the bench. Like you can see
He
that if he
might be in
wants.
game 2, you know, I mean.
But I'll tell you what, Bruce. Like, so here's what I take out of it. Like, I do
Mhm.
think if it was just if it was just one, the players who did well with McDavid are of a certain type, and I think that might be telling us something. That that McDavid is such a straight line player himself, except when he gets in the offensive the zone, then he's everywhere. But when he's going up the ice, he's a rocket. And these other players who can rocket up the ice, it might be an idea. Like, like I'm not saying you go with Nygaard, Athanasiou, and McDavid, but maybe
Right.
you do. Maybe you do. Because think about that line for a second. Think about the speed of that line when you're out against that line.
Greased lightning.
Like I would, too bad it's too bad there's not an exhibitions. Maybe there are some exhibition games or some in a regular season when you can try out your lines. I'd love to see a line next year because all these guys will probably be back with the Oilers of Nygaard, Athanasiou, and McDavid together. And you know the success Archibald had is so surprising because he's not a skill player in any way. But we can all remember he did very well with McDavid. And again, he's a straight line player who's got some speed and some grit to his game. So he's a
Cause some.
similar player. Cassian, I think will be on McDavid's line in the playoffs.
Yeah.
And if it was me picking, I
Mhm.
really liked Ennis. Although like
Right.
Ennis's results with McDavid, 5 goals for, 5 goals against, are kind of. But I did see some chemistry there, and Ennis is a veteran player, and I would like to see Ennis and Cassian. Personally, that's what I think I would pick. Although I can see. I don't think they're going to go with the all speed line of the drag race line of
Right.
Egard, Athanasiou, and McDavid, but I could see the attraction of there's they're not going to experiment and do it. So in theory that might work, but I think they would wait till the regular season to ever give that a try.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing was at the end they went with kind of with that no speed line of Kara between Neal and Jason, but they did well, as you say. And Kara moved into the middle, and maybe he's a better center than a winger. I mean, if you just believe the goals results, he did better playing center. Uh, I'm
Yes.
not sure I believe it, but I, it was the last three games. I think that Haas was in the press box because they moved Kara into the middle, and that was when they put that line of those three big, slower guys together. But they did all right. So I wouldn't surprise me one bit that that's the line that starts in the playoffs. And I just think Nygaard to start is just going to be the odd man out.
Yeah. I don't
Nygaard,
like,
Haas, and Russell, Patrick Russell, are going to be the fifth line. That's
yeah.
a pretty good fifth line. Like a spare players, like
Yeah.
that's Oilers got so much better depth than they've had for years.
I don't. I think Haas is a better even strength hockey player than Kara. I
Hmm.
like Haas's defensive play in his own zone. I
Hmm.
liked it from the
I do
start of the
too.
year. He covered those guys. He kept himself between his check and the net consistently. The only reason I was cringing a bit when you're talking about Kara at center, and again, Jujhar Kara was a fantastic penalty killer this year.
Yep.
But I just those turnovers in his own zone in the slot kept popping in my head as you were saying that.
Hmm.
Maybe those happened when he was a winger and not when he's a center,
Pretty much.
so he can have some
He
hope.
only played a few games of center, and they were the last few, and looked like he was impressing Tippett enough that he kept throwing him back out there for the next game. And I mean, obviously, we don't know what would have happened in the last 11 games. So a lot of things might have changed, but that's where things were when this season became frozen in time.
Bruce, you did a little research and digging into just the changing. Like forever, there was a complaint about the Oilers roster that it was didn't have enough NHL players, and B that it was an unbalanced roster. Didn't have enough. Sometimes it didn't have enough young players. Sometimes it didn't have enough older players. Often it lacked players in the prime years of their career between
Right. That
23
was
and
a big
28.
problem.
The 23 to 28-year-old or 24 to 27-year-old crowd, whichever,
Hmm.
however you want to frame it, it really lacked players in that category. How do the Oilers this year stack up to the Blackhawks, for instance, in that category this year?
Very different. I mean, if you look back in the past, you can look at, I just looked at two seasons, but I think you could look at most seasons in the 2010s. And you'd find the Oilers always had a couple of young players in the 18, 19, 20-year-old category. And they balance that out with a couple of relics in the 35 plus category, but they were always missing in the middle of the lineup. And the 2015-16, I chose that one because that was the beginning of the McDavid era. And they had three core players really that were 18 to 20 years old when Nurse, Draisaitl, and McDavid basically broke into the team into the league together. Remember that training camp that year, and you could just see the changing of the guard taking place. And so they played three players of the 27 on the roster who played 15 or more games. They played 13% of the games, 15% of the minutes, 20% of the points. So they got a lot of minutes, and they made those minutes count. Like they were productive players. But in the middle of the lineup, between 24 and 29 years old, that only accounted for about um, just about 50% of the ice time. And Chicago, on the other hand, had a more experienced team, and they were especially in the 30 to 32. They had more experience. Of course, this was they were the defending champions for the third and last time, so they were just beginning to come off of the peak. But they had zero players in the 18 to 20 range, like none. And
Hmm.
the Oilers had sort of three of their most important players were in that range. Well, Chicago beat Edmonton in the standings by 33 points that year. Like it was not close. And this year, it's not quite the reverse, but what we have for the Oilers is a nice tightening into the middle of the pack. They have zero 18 to 20-year-olds this year, none, for the first time in ages. The Oilers haven't forced some teenager or some rookie pro right into the NHL and right into an important position. That's been their standard fare. Well, Ken Holland, that's not how he does business, and you can see it. 18 to 20-year-old, no players. 21 to 23-year-olds, about 20% of their players were in that range,
Hmm.
and 24 to 26-year-olds, about 40%, and 27 to 29, about 30%. So that's like 90% of the ice time is guys between 21 and 29. And then in the 30 to 32 range, basically they had James Neal, and then right at the end they had Tyler Ennis, that was 30.
Yeah.
And I guess I had Sam Gagne before that, it was 30. But that, they're by far the lion's share of their team is within maybe 3 years of their peak. Like we say, a peak player is 20, 27 years old. Well, nowadays in the 23 to 26 group, you have all of McDavid, Draisaitl, Nurse, Nugent Hopkins, Clefbaum, which to me that's the five core players on the Oilers. First round draft choices from the first half of the last decade, where now, those five guys among them they have over 2,000 games in the NHL. Well, 4 years ago, those same five guys had, a couple hundred games in the NHL, a few hundred games at most. And so as they've sort of moved into the sort of wheelhouse near the middle of their career, Chicago Stars have started to rotate out of that sort of high point of their career and down the shoulder of their declining years. And you're talking about Patrick Kane and Jonathan Toews, both 31 years old. Duncan Keith, who's 36, Brent Seabrook, who's 34. I mean, those are Chicago's core players of all their cup teams. Well, I mean, Taves and Kane are still fantastic players at age 31, don't get me wrong, but they're probably down a court from where they were at 27 when they were, just winning the last of their Stanley Cups at age 26. And so that's an area where it's just one of these uh, rotation things. Like uh, a team comes together and they come up together, and then uh, if you have a good core of similar ages, well, eventually they're all going to get old together, and and that's what they're seeing in Chicago. So to me, Edmonton has a significant advantage. I mean, they had uh, 18 to 20-year-olds on their team this year. They had I think three guys, two for sure. They had their last two first round draft choices, Kirby Doc and what's the other fellow's name? Adam Boquist. Both played regularly for Chicago this year. Whereas the equivalent to Adam Boquist that was taken in the same draft 2 picks later, Evan Bouchard never played a game in the NHL, right? Because the Oilers had defensemen that were ahead of him on the curve, closer to their own peaks, that they could afford to keep Bouchard down in the minors for a while. So at this time, it seems like Edmonton has the advantage that Chicago has had forever.
Yeah. And this is why, Bruce, I'm so bullish on the Oilers right now. Actually,
Mm-hmm.
it's a Stanley Cup contender because this is a team it's got everything, the depth, the top end scoring, the penalty killing, the power play, the strong defense, top 4D,
Mm-hmm.
the three lines that are working, decent fourth line. Everything's in place for them to go on a strong Stanley Cup run. It really is. They should be considered one of the Stanley Cup favorites in the top 8 teams to win the Stanley Cup. I'd say maybe even the top five. But for one thing, and this is the goaltending issue, and that's where that's where they could have an early exit if Smith and Koskinen don't come through. Now, this is the way it is with every team in the playoffs this year with their goaltending, of course. But some teams are more likely to get
100%.
better goaltending than the Oilers, are they not? Like the Oilers, with the Oilers goaltending, it's a bit more iffy than a lot of the teams because Smith is old and not at his peak anymore, and Koskinen is unproven. So that's the
Smith has,
big question mark.
Smith has a career playoff save percentage of 938.
Woo, prove it in and that's for 25 games. I'll
Yeah.
take that.
Yeah, he was super red hot for Arizona one year, and they went into the third round. And you remember the series
Yeah, I think I do remember that.
when Dustin Brown kneed Shane Doan in a key play, and there was this huge uproar, and it was like Coles to Newcastle, two dirty players. But Doan made a lot out of it. Anyway, they got knocked out in the third round that year, and Smith had been fantastic. Like he was the reason they got as far as they did. So that's ancient history, and that's most of his
He was,
16 of his playoff games. But even last year,
yeah,
he
he was
came
good,
in for
wasn't he?
Calgary, and he was the only thing saving Calgary from even more utter humiliation than they did receive because he got slaughtered with over 50 shots 2 games in a row, and then in Colorado it was just they were all over him, and it was only Smith that kept the score down, below a snowman probably, and so he made a lot of saves in there, even though they lit him up for quite a few goals, but I mean 50 shots, you're going to get your goals.
Yeah.
So
So the
so
Chicago, you were mentioning that the Chicago Stars might be down a few quarts.
mhm.
And I was expecting to see that when I dug into their numbers, and I can't remember
Not
if
so
we talked
much,
about
eh?
this on the last podcast or not, but I'll just go quickly over the scoring numbers. At even strength this year, Jonathan Toews outscored Connor McDavid at even strength. Toews he was the 10th highest even strength point getter in the NHL this year, 3.02 points per 60. McDavid was at 2.87. So they're very close.
Right.
Yamamoto was seventh in the league. Draisaitl with
Wow.
8, Taves 10th, Kane 11th, McDavid 17, and Dominic Kubalik, who's quite a fantastic rookie hockey player. I think he scored 30 goals for the Blackhawks. He was 22nd, and then there's a pretty big drop off after that, all for both teams. So both teams have, and it turns out, Bruce, they didn't have that line of Taves, Kane, and Kubalik together very much in Chicago this year,
Right.
only for 100 minutes or so. But when they did, those guys just smoked the opposition. They had like a 70, I think it was 71% goals for percentage,
Wow.
that group of players. So you'd think, why don't you just have that as a line, Kane, Taves, and Kabalik? It just turns out, though, that there's no other combinations in Chicago that work at all, really. If you don't, everyone on the Chicago Blackhawks, there's a couple of rules. When you look at their lineup, everyone that plays with Patrick Kane starts scoring points and plays well. Patrick Kane is I think easily the best player on that team, and easily one of the best players in the NHL right now. Remains so. He's an extremely dangerous player. That wasn't the case with Taves. Taves only
Three.
he had this high even strength scoring, but in terms of goals for and against, when you
Mhm.
balance that out, they were giving up a lot of goals when Jonathan Taves was on the ice. So there was lots of scoring, but there was lots of scoring against. And only when he was teamed with Kabalik did you get a good goals for percentage. I think it was 57%
Mhm.
for the Hawks with Kabalik out there. So they're kind of, and it's also interesting, Bruce. They have a couple players, Alex DeBrincat, who a lot of people really like. Man, he had a tough year.
He had a tough
They
year, yeah.
they could hardly find anyone who would have success on the ice in a top six role with Alex DeBrincat. With Taves, there was a goals for percentage of 30%, six
Wow.
goals for, 14 against. With Kane,
Brutal.
with Patrick Kane, he was the one exception to the rule of DeBrincat, and it was 44% goals for percentage in 428 minutes. They played those guys
DeBrincat and
together.
Kane?
Yeah,
Wow.
DeBrincat and Kane. Now maybe they're too similar. Maybe they both need the puck or something, but that did not work.
I thought they both played right wing, but I guess if they played 400 minutes together, they didn't both play right wing.
Yeah, unless I have the stats wrong, but I don't believe I did. I was
Oh.
checking these and rechecking them. That said, there was one combination where you had Kane and DeBrincat on the ice together when they were with Dylan Strome,
Mm-hmm.
where they had real success. So that was the one place where you could put DeBrincat in a top six role, and he had some real success. So it looks like one line in Chicago should be Strome, Kane, and DeBrincat, and then they have to figure out who should play with Taves and Kabalik, and they don't really have any obvious choice. Brandon Saad was kind of like DeBrincat. He
Mm-hmm.
struggled with various players. He struggled when he was with Jonathan Taves. He struggled when he was with Kabalik. That line was not good when they had the Saad, Taves, and Kabalik out together. That line wasn't very good at all, and they used them quite a bit. So I'm thinking they might want to use a young guy called Alexander Nylander,
Mm-hmm.
who actually scored at a fairly good rate at even strength, and he didn't play with Taves and Kabalik at all to speak of
Yeah,
in
I
the
know.
season. But he did when he just played with Taves on his own. Those two guys seemed to click. So they might want to go with Nylander, and that was interesting because that Nylander trade for Yokoharu was very
Yeah.
controversial. People thought the Sabres had won that trade, but I would say in the first season, Nylander had a pretty darn good season, pretty fairly promising season with the Blackhawks, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see him on a top line in the playoffs.
Yeah, I had him in my keeper league, and I kept every time I watched Chicago, he was playing on a line without the star players, and I kept swearing at the coach. But he's pretty smooth. I mean, he's a Nylander, right? And they all are pretty nifty dipsy doodlers, the dad and the brother, and young Alexander as well. And he's young. I mean, that's the thing. They got some superior talent that's young. I mean, Dylan Strome was a former number 3 overall draft choice. They got Kirby Doc on the third or fourth line or wherever the heck it is. They got him. A very high end talent from last year's draft pool. It's probably a couple years too early uh, for him to make a real impact. But they've got uh, between DeBrincat, Nylander, Strome, Doc. I mean, that's
Kabalik.
four. Kubalik, yeah. I mean, Kubalik's a bit older, 24-year-old rookie, but that's some pretty impressive young talent on the forward line. And then, of
Yeah,
course, on the back end, they got Boqvist that's just making his mark.
yeah. DeBrincat had a real down year, and maybe it's just a
Yeah,
1 year thing. I don't know if he was injured or not. That's often the case when you see a pretty strong downward trend in a player's game in one
yeah, he
season.
had 41 goals last year, and it looked like he was going to be a perennial big-time scorer.
Their forwards line, Bruce, strike me as one Yamamoto shy of a load. Like you remember how everything changed for the Oilers when suddenly
Yep.
this player came and he made this one line work, but then the other lines also worked. Chicago just seems to be missing in some ways that player who can play with Kabalik and Taves, for instance, and suddenly make that line really strong and go
Not
because
Drake Caggiula, eh?
it doesn't he didn't get a lot of time with the top guys.
Yeah.
He wasn't they didn't really trust him to play those top 6 minutes. So and Brandon Saad just seemed to take a step back. I don't know and I'm just going by the stats and I'm going by kind of imperfect stats, goals
Right.
for percentage, which again we've talked about how iffy that is. So I could be wrong about a lot of this, but Brandon Saad looked like, man, I don't know. Was the Panarin for Saad trade made
Ah, just
made
gonna say.
for was it made for salary cap reasons? Because
Not really, because they were both like $6 million players at the time. I think Panarin, his contract may have been coming due. Like there was some issue there that they decided to bring back Brandon Saad, who they traded away to Columbus. And to me, that trade was a disaster for Chicago.
yeah,
And
it really
so,
was. It really was. I
I
mean,
mean, Saad's an okay player, but holy moly, Artemi Panarin's one of the best players in the NHL.
well, just think if you had this team
Oh,
that I just described. So let's
yeah.
say you had one line of Strome, Kane, and DeBrincat, which had in 244 minutes together, they were 14 goals for, 8 against. Okay, that's pretty good.
Hmm.
That line actually worked this year, even with DeBrincat having this iffy year. If you could throw out Kabalik, Taves, and Panarin
Yeah.
for your next
They
line,
wouldn't be in 12th place. Let's put it that way.
no, it seemed to change the face and the fate of the Chicago Blackhawks franchise in a strange trade to make when you still have Kane and Taves in their late prime.
Right.
Still could still win Stanley Cups, and you're trading away the best young player other than those two guys. I don't like I'm just looking at it
Yeah. Well,
retrospectively, but that trade, man, that was a brutal trade. Ooh.
yeah. Well, the post that I wrote about the age of the players, I went back and I chose that 2015-16 season, as I mentioned, and the two youngest Chicago forwards on that team were Philip Deneau, 22-year-old Philip Deneau, who they
Ah,
traded to
geez.
Montreal for an ancient Thomas Fleischman, who was at the very end of the line, played a few games for Chicago and was done. Philip Deneau is now a legitimate Selke Trophy candidate. And then when you take at the end of that year, they traded Toivu Teravainen their youngest forward, to Carolina Hurricanes in a salary dump. They had to get rid of Brian Bickle's salary, and they had to sweeten the pot, and they threw in Toivo Teravainen, and they got a couple of picks back, but they didn't do anything with the picks, at least not yet. And so basically, they took two young, super talented, or at least, I mean, I don't know if you call Deneau super talented, but man,
Good
a
two-way
player
player.
like that, yeah. Like, I mean, I'm just imagining. I mean, if I was a Chicago fan, I'd be thinking back on those trades the way I do think are back on the trade of Ryan Strome
Well, I think the
and
Aaron trade is
you
way.
know, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you put
So he
all
was
those trades together, they got rid of like some pretty strong talent up front, and they didn't get near as much back as they gave away.
he was 25 years old, Bruce, when they traded him. He excuse me. He scored 74 points in 82 games for Chicago.
Hmm.
Then they had a terrible playoff series. 4 games they got bumped out. He only had 1 assist in 4 games. And
Hmm.
maybe it was one of those things where, oh geez, he let us down in the playoffs. So we need to get tougher. We need better chemistry. We need a bigger, we need to change the mix. So let's bring in Brandon Saad again. But
We
wow,
won with
trading a
Brandon Saad.
25-year-old player who's almost a point per game player in his
Yeah.
first 2 seasons in the NHL, and you're moving him out.
Hmm.
Uh, that's just
Yeah,
brutal.
all I know is if they had a extra line on their team that had Philip Danault between Toivo Teravainen and Artemi Panarin, that would be absolute killer.
Ouch.
Three real good players that
And
they
then
got
they
less than value for.
then they could have left Kirby Doc and Major Junior, where he probably would have been better off. And
Exactly.
well, they probably wouldn't have been drafting Kirby. They
Probably
wouldn't be in a
not.
position to draft Kirby Doc. So,
Exactly.
oh well, 3 Stanley Cups for that regime and the Chicago Blackhawks. So they were doing something right all those years. They had to shed a lot of players. To be fair to them, they had to shed a lot
Yeah.
of really good hockey players for salary cap reasons, and and so you could say, well, why didn't you do a better job of managing the salary cap? Well, it's hard, right? Like when you're winning Stanley Cups, it's very difficult. And sure, they overpaid for some Seabrook, some other
Seabrook.
contracts were, and Bickle, as you mentioned,
Hmm.
and but man, they lost a lot of really good hockey players in the non-salary cap era of the NHL. The Blackhawks probably would have won 4 or 5 Stanley Cups. I think that team, as opposed to 3, which
Well, I
is
know. I mean, they won
impressive.
their first cup in 2010, and that year, that summer, because of all the salary things that were coming due, like Taves and Kane, that were both at the end of the ELC, so they both got like $5 million raises, and they had to dump Dustin Byfuglien, Andrew Ladd. They lost their goalie Antti at that time because they just didn't have the room to pay him. They moved on from a couple other players too. I can't remember. It was quite a list though. And Stan Bowman,
Boland,
David Boland, yeah,
yeah,
and and he
yeah.
was an important player. Actually, he went after 2013, so he was a different turnover group than the 2010 group. But uh, the salary cap clipped Chicago's wings pretty hard, and they still got 3 cups in 6 years.
So
And then
Brandon,
Stan Bowman's, I mean, his latest mistakes after the last cup has, one of the reasons they've fallen from contention is that they just don't have a good enough supporting cast for their big, their core players.
Brandon Saad was, I think, 23 when they made that trade. He was coming off 82 games, 53 points for the Blue Jackets, and yeah, he had won 2 cups in Chicago, and he was a young player, young, um, big, strong two-way hockey player. So there you go. That's how Stanley Cups are won and lost,
Yep.
and woe to the Chicago Blackhawks for that trade. Well, Bruce, anything else we were going to talk about tonight, or have we covered it all? We have.
Well, we talked about Neal and Neal's line mates,
Yeah.
and by extension, sort of the potential line combinations, because I know you were looking at McDavid's line mates.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of the main things that either things we've written about recently or are about to write about in the next day or two that this podcast will be pertinent to those posts. So
Yeah, I guess the players are going to start skating together. Is it June 8th? Tomorrow?
yes,
It's tomorrow,
yeah,
Monday.
yeah.
So we'll see who comes to Edmonton, who's here in
Hmm.
Edmonton. We'll see when the European players start to arrive
Yeah.
here, which
Yeah,
I think is a big thing. Go ahead.
Kurt had a list in his post today of guys that were hanging around town, and
Yeah,
he said, Nugent Hopkins and Kara are out in BC, and Nugent Hopkins apparently is in no rush to come to Edmonton to join the camp as long as he can get out on the ice wherever. He
yeah.
just needs to start skating. It's just going to be so weird, David, to go from a training camp right into the playoffs. I mean, two exhibition games, but right into the playoffs. I see the NBA figured out a way to finish their regular season in some reasonable format and then go to playoffs as opposed to this NHL craziness. But
The
what can we
NBA,
do but sigh and dismay
the
about what the
NBA,
NHL
yeah,
decides?
the NBA has a huge TV contract,
Yep.
absolutely massive,
Hmm.
and maybe more of a TV revenue league than the NHL. So maybe there was much larger financial incentive for the NBA to do that. I'm just guessing. I don't know the answer to that either.
One hub city, Orlando.
Yeah, they're all there, eh? Wow, they got all those hotels, the Disney hotels, I guess,
It's
eh?
a
Is that where
small
they're going to
world
be?
after all.
Yeah, I guess there's all these hotels. A lot of people aren't there. Florida's having just right now a massive upsurge. I noticed in COVID cases. So
Yeah, well,
anyway, these things change
are
fast.
they actually counting them? I mean, Florida is one of those ones
Yeah,
that's a little suspect about
yeah,
about their record
some
keeping and such. And
controversy
I
there.
mean, something like that could really crimp their style if they're putting all their eggs in one basket and then something goes to hell on the on outbreak side. But
Yeah, I guess the idea is for all of this, you could have it in a place where there was actually massive pandemic going on, and you have the players in quarantine, so that shouldn't matter in theory. But it strikes me you're a heck of a lot safer, and in a city where there's 20 new cases a day as opposed to I don't know what it is in Orlando. I can only get Miami's the epicenter of their latest outbreak. So anyway, good luck to them. I
mhm,
don't want
no,
to hopefully it all works out for
hopefully it's
everybody
everywhere.
and everywhere on this COVID front and they're
It's
forging
caused.
ahead. I hope their plan works. I hope they get it right. Bruce, thank you for talking tonight.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening.
And in the meantime, and in between times, this has been another edition of the Cult of Hockey podcast.